welcome to the latest episode of Southside Stories, where we talk to leaders, founders, entrepreneurs of companies, typically in and around London. But actually today is an exception because we're going to talk to Julien. Hello, Julien. How are you?
Hi there, Matt. Yeah, well, listen, I can probably count as pseudo-Londoner, having
Yeah, you can, for sure.
born there and brought up there and lived there for a
Absolutely.
number of years before I disappeared off to other parts of the world, yeah.
Yeah, great. And we're going to cover a little bit of that in a sec. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to Southside Stories, wherever you get your podcasts. Today, though, we're going to talk about the world of health tech, funding for health tech. Still a very vibrant area, of course, coming out of COVID. It was huge 5 years ago, but it's still very important. Lots of great companies in the UK and Europe doing great things around health tech, some of which we've had or will be having on the podcast very shortly. But let's throw to you, Julien. Julien, tell us a little about you. Where are you based now? Tell us a little bit about your company. Let's start there.
Okay, I'm based in Basel in Switzerland, which is really the life science corner of Switzerland, with Novartis, Roche, both other players are actually headquartered here. I can actually see the Roche towers from the office window. Not intentional, but it's the way it is since they build the towers. The work that we do at Galen Growth, it's a company I created about 10 years ago now, just shy of that. It's very global. Our impact intends to be that way as well. And so Galen Growth is the leading provider of business intelligence to industry investors and startups, focused and specialized on digital healthcare technology innovation, aka digital health, HealthTech, and various other terminology.
And prior to Galen, and Galen's been going for a good while now, 10 years, as you say. What was your experience before? I think you were involved with life sciences even before Galen, weren't you?
Yes, absolutely. So after a shortish stint, let's say, in Her Majesty's British Armed Forces, I did an MBA and I joined Eli Lilly, and I've been in healthcare ever since. So I guess look at it at about, just somewhere between 2 decades and 3 decades of focused on that convergence of technology, innovation, and healthcare. All of it focused on what I would describe as the growth strategy, and execution of that growth strategy. And then having worked in large brands in both pharma and medical devices before switching about 10 years ago and starting my own company. So bringing a lot of what I learned to what I was building, but of course learning a hell of a lot as an entrepreneur.
Great, and we're going to get into a bit more of that in a second. Tell us then a little bit more about Galen Growth. Typically, what clients do you work with? What problems do you solve for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Galen was something I founded leaving a pharmaceutical company, to fill a gap, a pain point. As pharma companies are starting to get a little more interested in that conversions of data and software innovation in healthcare. Obviously, then we started taking a greater interest in who was doing what and who was doing what with whom. But I was finding it very difficult to really get hold of reliable insights and data to be able to make some informed decisions. And as my peers seem to be experiencing the same challenges, I thought, well, let's try and solve this. I stepped out of this large pharma co and created Galen Growth. At the time, I was based in Singapore, so it was very much a regional focus, Asia Pacific, which is growing extremely fast, but is, of course, a region with low-income markets, middle-income markets, as well as mature markets, e.g. Japan, Singapore, etc. And so I set off to solve that pain point, and really wanted to solve it in a way that made sense for those people or those organizations, those stakeholders that were engaging and wanting to engage with that ecosystem of innovation, and therefore be able to answer the questions in a language they would use with replies that would be directly relevant to what they're doing. So from there, humble beginnings in Singapore, we found ourselves with our clients, and I'll come back to your question in 2 seconds, but our clients essentially saying, that's great, but could you do it for the rest of the planet as well? And so we started expanding our footprint as well as our presence across the globe. And we are essentially now really the global leading business intelligence provider to pharmaceutical companies, to medical device companies, insurance companies, health systems like the NHS, for example, the private equity, the venture capital industry, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially any organization you could possibly think of that is engaging with the ecosystem of digital health or digital healthcare technology innovations, I call it, because we are looking at the entire value chain of healthcare. And then want that information, that insight, seeing the wood from the trees, really, to be able to make informed decisions as they engage with innovators, or as they plan their strategy, or as they decide what their investment strategy is going to be, or their budget is going to be, etc. So it's a fairly broad set of applications for all these clients because they have a very broad set of needs. So yeah, Galen Growth, in as a nutshell, they could describe it. Our work is either providing those data insights to these clients, or sometimes, in fact, doing the heavy lifting for them. But our core focus is on that provision of those insights, and we do so through a solution called HealthTech Alpha, which is a platform that allows our premium customers to essentially log in and do all of their research and analysis directly from the platform, and to basically be able to pull data out, or build presentations, or do their own triage, etc. on the platform. And we do that through various really exciting bits of let's say user interface type workflows, which of course has really gone on to steroids in the past year or so with the whole Gen AI, ChatGPT, for those people who are very familiar with that space, and bringing that into play. So, for example, our users can do a lot of research using a ChatGPT, say, lookalike type copilot that allows them to interrogate the data that way, as opposed to the more conventional, filter approach to data. Anyway,
Let's just back out because I want to go into the platform for sure.
Please.
But just to back out for one sec, and we used to work together.
Yes, true.
And I used to use the platform, by the way, for those listening, is an incredibly powerful, easy to use platform. And the way I was using it when we were working together was finding in the life insurance sector, health tech partners that could accelerate, for example, life insurance innovation and solve some of the core insurer metrics, basically reducing claims, keeping people healthy in the life insurance world.
Yep.
What would be another use case, though, that really demonstrates the power of the platform?
So there are many. As you can imagine, of course, every client has their own needs, and we do try to keep as much as what our clients are doing on the platform confidential. In fact, we don't have much visibility of what they're actually doing on the platform, to respect data privacy rules, as well as, of course, respect the confidentiality of the work that our clients are doing. But the more common use cases would be, what's our competitors doing? How does that inform our strategy about what they're doing, as well as, of course, how do we rate what they're doing, and do we pick from what they're doing as well, kind of thing. So if you're a large pharma co and you're looking at oncology, and you're looking at, let's say, breast cancer more specifically, you know who your key competitors are, but you're quite intrigued as to what they're doing, then it's a very rich source of information. Another use case, for example, would be to literally identify problem statements within the company you're trying to solve. Say you're trying to launch a new drug. How would you leverage digital health in a pure sense of digital health to enhance or augment that whole product life cycle management strategy that you've got? And therefore, how do you identify the digital health ventures that are either already focused on what you're doing, and therefore you can leverage very quickly what they're doing, or potentially you're doing something similar, and therefore you could leverage their technology and their know-how as well. I mean, this is a couple of use cases. You could imagine if you're an investor, it's much more about deal flow. It's much more about understanding which ventures are at an investment stage prior to the one that your sweet spot is, but they're coming into your sweet spot next, and therefore how do you look for those? All the way through to do some research around, building comparative tables to try and really ascertain valuation, ascertain comparison, and really satisfying yourself really that the thing that you're wanting to invest in is really a leader in its own category, rather than the pitch deck you received that is usually full of very positive language, but not necessarily telling you the nitty gritty of the whole ecosystem.
Give us a sense then of the data and the platform. I'm really curious. Let's start with HealthTech Ventures. How many of those are there worldwide? How many kind of details of investors? Because it's a massive data pool that you've really effectively found a way to interrogate and filter and use AI to find answers. Give us a sense of the underlying data, the volume, and what's in that.
Absolutely. So listen, just to remind everyone again, we are a specialist. So unlike some other data platforms people may be familiar with that I would describe as more generalist, in other words, multi-sectorial, a lot of tech verticals in there. But as a result, there's some limited depth in terms of the sort of data points that are available that allow you to do due diligence. So we are specialists in what I'm describing intentionally, as digital healthcare technology innovation. And that's really that conversion of software and data as it relates to healthcare. And so AI, of course, plays a very strong role in there, and has done for the last 12 months and will continue to do so. To answer your question directly, because we have a sort of database that is essentially a relational database, we look at the ecosystem through the lens of the startup. By startup here, I mean something that's very young all the way through to something that has publicly listed or been acquired, and we'll continue to track beyond that particular stage in their life cycle. So currently our platform users can analyze 15,000 plus digital health ventures, that is startups, scale-ups, and publicly listed ventures. And of course, can then interrogate every single relationship each of those digital health companies have. And so we are continuously adding to the platform, but we always validate everything we put live on the platform. So there is, at any one day, a set of digital ventures sitting in what we would call a ready to go live, but still needs to be checked and validated before it goes live as far as our users are able to access the data. So that means 50,000 live ventures, mostly in the private sector. In other words, non-publicly listed, for our clients to interrogate. Where we really differentiate ourselves is then the depth of the data that we carry on each of these ventures. And by that, I mean that we do the usual funding data that you would expect. It's important because, of course, it is a demonstration of the momentum a particular venture has built. But it's also only one facade, I guess, one profile aspect of a venture. And therefore, we get into the other important measures, such as, for example, the quality of the leadership team, or more specifically, who is the leadership team? And then we can look at the quality of it, for example, in terms of what it achieves. I'm not talking about PhDs and other academic type qualifications. You can imagine in healthcare, most digital health venture founders are qualified up to ding dong. So it's really around looking at what they've actually achieved in their tenure. Uh-huh. But we then get into aspects of data that you will not find in other platforms. So, for example, we look at the clinical evidence of a digital health venture, for example, and there we look at what has it done to prove its medical claims. Looking at the clinical trial data, looking at the patents they have, looking at the publications they've made, etc. And so, that's a sort of granularity of data that we carry that we know are directly relevant to not only investors, but also, of course, the large corporates and, of course, other startups. And we can get back to some of those use cases as well, particularly around startups, for example. So that's the sort of, data. That's the data layer itself. You're looking at about 1 billion data points at the moment. And, of course, that's dynamic, so it's growing every single day. We overlay on there a very advanced set of workflow to allow our users to interrogate the data. And as I said, it ranges from the data geek that use the actual detailed analysis type filters to build tables of data. The business analysts in the team, all the way through to the SVP of the team, much more senior, is actually looking for very specific answers. And there, of course, they can just go into the, as I was saying to you before, the AI co-pilot and say, hey, listen, how many ventures in oncology have IPO'd in the last 5 years? And the co-pilot will go and get the data. So essentially, you're cutting out all of the heavy lifting that a data analyst would have to go through if they were using all the filters. But of course, you get different level of granularity as your answer. So that's it. And then on top of that, we have really moved into that deeper insights play, which is, okay, well, fine, data's fine. It's important because you need to be able to back up the analysis you're doing. You need to be able to enable your user to be able to essentially build a picture they're going to build. But you need to get into deeper insights. You need to help people see what's valuable out there. It's almost moving into predictions. It's a word I use lightly, really, because we're not a crystal ball, but we are trying to build the indicators that help our users start to predict, in inverted commas, and therefore get answers to some of their questions. Looking at a particular venture, if you're an investor, how does it compare? Well, you help them try and look at how that particular venture fits within its own peer group, for example. And that's where we're very good, because we're specialists. We're able to define a peer group that's directly relevant to that venture, rather than something that happens to be in the same geography and happens to be at the same funding stage, which, of course, not a peer. It just happens to be, as I guess, the vague correlation to the situation of the other venture. Hopefully that's making sense to the audience. But so those are sort of things that we move to. So we're looking at a whole bunch of signals that we've built ourselves, purely data-driven. So there's no hype, no bias in there. It literally is a black and white picture of how that venture is tracking over time, but also how it compares within its own ecosystem.
Great. Let's just talk a little bit about just for the venture itself now.
Yeah.
15,000 of them. Now, clearly, you've got an active pool of people on. I guess it's basically kind of like a marketplace, isn't it? And you've got this great data resource in the middle of it. You've got this active community of corporates, pharmaceuticals, life insurers, investors on the one hand, trying to find a great match or doing other kinds of research. And then, of course, you've got the health company ventures themselves listed there. Let's just switch to the HealthTech ventures for a minute.
Yeah.
Clearly, they've got a big advantage to be listed. Just tell us some of the advantages of them being represented. If they're not on there, how do they get on there? How could the ventures themselves get value from the tool?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That often people forget that data provision is not just to the big boys. It's also very important for the innovators. In healthcare or digital health, it's almost doubly important. And what I mean by that is that invariably your entrepreneur team is usually the science, the engineering side, and therefore very strong at product building. And then when they start turning their attention to the whole commercial side, that's why they need a helping hand. So a lot of them, of course, reach out to coaches, to advisory boards, etc., in order to be able to really start getting a head around, okay, so what does my go-to-market strategy look like? But any go-to-market strategy needs to be well informed. You need to understand how unique are you? How do you differentiate yourself? Who do you need to work with in order to scale? Who typically invest in ventures such as the one that you built in order to be able to to attract funding, etc. So we work very closely with digital ventures in terms of we want them to be engaged with the platform. We want to be what one digital venture described to me a couple of years ago, the LinkedIn of digital health. In other words, making sure that the CV, the resume of the digital venture is always fully up to date on the platform, so that, of course, they're presenting their best foot to any large organization, stroke investor, stroke health system that actually is interrogating the platform to get answers to their questions. And so we have a workflow that allows a venture to be able to ensure that their profiles up to date. To take ownership of a profile's already there. Invariably, we pride ourselves on making sure that we're one step ahead. In other words, the profile's there. We want the founder or the one of the members of the C-suite to take ownership of that particular profile and to ensure that it is updated with either slightly incorrect information that needs to be corrected or gaps that need to be up to date. We try to avoid any of those, but we like to hear it from the horse's mouth kind of thing. Our role is to ensure that it is fair and accurate. So we don't want pitch deck data in there. That's fully aspirational and it's great. It looks forward and it answers certain questions around the what if of the future. We are also very keen to ensure that we are recording the actual status of that particular venture. So we do encourage digital ventures to step into the platform and engage with us. Use the platform for themselves. So we have a very attractive, fee rate, let's say, for digital ventures to use the platform, so that they manage their cash flow carefully, and therefore we recognize that. We also go one step further than that. As part of our pay forward, let's say, into the ecosystem. And that is that we allow all pre-seed, or pre-A, in fact, digital ventures, once proven that they're digital health, to get free access to the platform, basically. So they get full premium access to the platform for a period of up to 12 months. That really allows them to leverage the platform to their advantage. And there's a quick pro quo, really. It's making sure that they're on the platform and therefore fully listed and actually reflected. And of course, we pay back by allowing them to be able to leverage the data to build a pitch deck with the right competitor landscape slide in it, for example, or to start knocking on the right doors in relation to which health system or which pharma code they need to be talking to start the conversations around potential partnership, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Terrific. Great. We're going to go into a little bit more around funding, HealthTech funding, what that looks like in a second, particularly for UK and Europe. Just before we do that, just a couple of minutes just on Pharma.
Yeah.
Because, of course, Pharma, at the moment, every couple of years, Pharma sort of bursts into the mainstream, doesn't it? Of course, it was around COVID 5 years ago, and now it's around weight loss drugs. And we get a certain view of Pharma just through that mainstream, whenever it appears in the headline sort of thing. But as somebody that works very closely with pharmaceuticals, has all of this data, all of this knowledge, just give us the view of where pharma are at right now as an industry, the health, clearly drug pipeline and discovery is an important factor in how they're doing and their share price. And then we've got Trump as well. There's a lot of kind of stuff in the mix, isn't there, around that particular industry? What's your view of what's going on there now?
It's an industry that is at an inflection point, without doubt. It has, for many decades, built a business model that allows them to take innovation to market and to navigate a reasonably rigorous regulatory process to get their molecule product, their drug, into the hands of a patient by an intermediary, the healthcare professional, the doctor, the specialist, etc. And to do that on the back end of a highly efficient supply chain that allows them to get active ingredient from one part of the world, but finish the product in another part of the world, and therefore take maximal value out of the very tax conditions and regimes that exist. The value of pharmaco from a tax efficiency perspective is quite substantial. It should be underestimated. And of course, all of that powered by drug research and drug development engine. Some of those things are coming under threat for a lot of pharmacos. So, for example, their drug discovery engine is not as efficient as it's been, and therefore a lot of them are looking at patent expiry on some of their core products, for example, and not necessarily seeing their own drug pipeline generating the next blockbuster. The days of blockbusters frankly are gone. Blockbuster being, of course, a drug that's created more than $1 billion of revenue, but largely driven by the fact that in the past, pharma drugs were one size fits all. And so, a 10,000 patient clinical trial outcomes would then dictate the way that drug is being administered to all patients across the planet. Those days are dated because, of course, now we know much more about our DNA and much more about our phenotypes, and therefore we end up with drugs that should be much more targeted. So that's more on the drug discovery side. Clinical trials are obviously one I mentioned. And then, of course, as we know, patients are becoming much more informed about their own health, about availability of products, and therefore playing a much bigger role in the decisions around the drug that's been prescribed to them, or for that matter, how they manage their health, full stop. Not everyone, but increasingly patients are moving into that space. So it's an industry at an inflection point, and it needs to continue rethinking its business model. Digital health within that context has and will continue to play a very strategic role in the future of the pharmaceutical business model. And so we are seeing them engage, we are seeing them experiment, and we are seeing them looking at alternative business models through it, etc. There's been some shifting in the way in which they look at digital health. So in the early days, there was a very strong push towards how you leveraged it to engage with patients. The pill companion was one term we heard, and there's various other things out there. Digital therapeutics, of course, was a big hot topic. But the problem with a lot of these, or the challenges rather than problem with a lot of these solutions is, how do you monetize them? How do you show the return on investment of working with something that has a direct patient engagement, be it around adherence or be it around treatment management, etc. And so if you then contrast that to the whole drug pipeline challenge I described, what we've seen over the last 18 months to 2 years, probably longer, but certainly very evident in the last couple of years, has been a shift kind of away from what a more patient-centric solution to solutions that are much more drug discovery or clinical trial optimization, etc. And that's become very apparent, or certainly very deliberate, particularly now we're seeing a greater role from Gen AI type solutions in the space of drug discovery and the space of drug development, which means, of course, it's starting to yield efficiencies in a way in which a drug firm is able to manage its whole R&D, as it's called, a value chain element kind of thing. So that's what we're seeing. So it's by no means, there's no recipe out there, but it's really good to see some companies be quite bold in the way in which they're leveraging digital health for their drug discovery side, for their clinical development side, but also for their commercial model side. For example, Lilly Direct or Pfizer for All are two very interesting business models where essentially the drug firm has decided that it's going to leverage a construct of digital health companies, for example, telehealth and various other things, in order to try and enable patients to get easier access to drugs, such as, for example, GLP-1s, you mentioned it. Apologies. And so we're seeing some really interesting novel models coming through from that. So it's a fascinating time to be looking at that particular industry. Some of them being bold. Some of them, I think, are still waiting to see what happens.
Great. Okay, good roundup. Let's switch to funding. And let's put the lens on Europe and the UK as well, particularly within that European environment. Maybe just give us a headline. I mean, coming out of COVID, let's just talk about the global funding figure, maybe just to start there, just briefly.
Yeah.
I remember, and I'll probably get this wrong, but in the year, or towards the end of COVID, it was worldwide funding into digital health. Was it $50 billion, something in that region?
Yeah, the problem with those numbers, of course, it always driven by the taxonomy that defines digital health, but also what you're including in there in terms of deals. Are you including SPACs in there, or are you including just venture funding? It's suffice to say that 2021 is an anomaly as far as deal value in digital health across the globe. It's a record. It is yet to be broken. And it kind of initially confounded people because I think everyone thought that COVID would just basically kill deal making. In fact, the people weren't allowed to meet. But we saw quite the reverse. And I guess a lot of it driven by the fact that COVID also put limitations and constraints on the delivery of healthcare, and therefore pushed people to look for alternatives. And so we saw a massive pickup, for example, on telehealth.
Yeah.
And then, of course, conditions changed a little bit. So on the back of that very strong 2021, we then moved into a period of sobriety, let's call it that. Some of it driven by the fact that the whole quantitative easing, where governments were basically pushing money into the system to help the economy survive, started easing off, in late 2022. And then in 23 saw the outcomes of that. Suffice to say that funding, let's look at venture capital funding, forget the IPO and M&A type stuff. We can look at that later. But if you look at funding, it has slowed down. It is nowhere near the 2021 heady days. And it has slowed down till about 2024. And I would suggest 2024 has seen, hopefully, fingers crossed, let's see what happens at 25, as of course at the moment, that's not quite panning out as everybody thought it would pan out on the 1st of January of this year. But 24, we at Galen Growth certainly marked that as kind of rounding the corner, the hitting a bottom, let's say. And it's looking like, despite volatility in the system, that is a direction we are taking. There's some caveats there, but certainly 25 Q1 was strong, particularly in Europe. We saw a massive uptick in venture funding in digital health in Q1 of this year in Europe. The usual top three are France, Germany, and the UK. There have been some mega deals, and we can come back to that. But mega deals are deals that are worth more than 100 million US. The UK, you mentioned briefly in your question, is invariably number one in terms of the total funding share in Europe received by UK ventures or startups. And so it's fairly rare that it bubbles down to two. It's generally number one in the ranking order in Europe. And so it's often a focus of conversation when it comes to, okay, if you look at the European ecosystem, what does that look like, kind of thing?
Let's stick with the UK. And what sort of areas? What kind of areas? Let's maybe tackle it from a couple of different areas, but the particular therapeutic or disease areas or mental health in terms of attracting that funding. And we'll come on to the stages in a minute. But let's just stick with therapeutic areas.
It's a good way to look at the ecosystem and to try and see what is hot, let's say. So because of the way in which we record data and we look at the system in a way that is very relevant to our users, we're able to look at therapeutic areas, which is something that is usually quite hard to do if you're using the types of data provision. So listen, there are what I would call the stalwarts, the therapeutic areas that are always up there. And then let's look at the fast growth ones as well. So over the last 4 or 5 years, let's not go further back than that. All the digital health courses at least 10, if not, merging on to 15 years old now. But I would say that one of the therapeutic areas that continuously ranks in the top three, continuously receives, the lion's share of funding is oncology, without doubt. And that's the same at patient engagement level, the whole, let's say, the front end, patient end, and as well as of course down what we call the more R&D side, etc. So oncology is always up there. Cardiovascular is always up there, largely because it's still the biggest killer. Cardiovascular, it's one we're always aware of, but it's and sometimes often gets forgotten about simply because it's been around for a long time. But it's still attracting a lot of funding, because, as I said, it's one of the biggest killers, and it's usually asymptomatic until it's too late, which means that, there's a need to continue invested in that. Those are the two I would say that are the stalwarts, the ones that attract a lot of the funding. And then if you switch gears and you look at, okay, which ones are the fast growth ones that are really attracted funding lately? Mental health. So mental health has been interesting. It picked up a lot of interest from investors as we came out of COVID. And a lot of that's kind of echoing the media. If you recall, the media was really doubling down on the whole topic of mental health as we came out of COVID, at all age groups. And then it took a bit of a dive, I think, as investors took a step back and thought, let's see where this is going. And then over the last year, 18 months, we've seen a real resurgence of funding back into mental health. A lot of it being at patient engagement level, as opposed to the other end of the value chain. And the other one that's really hot is women's health. We could talk about men's health too, but women's health certainly is attracting more than men's health at this stage. Women's health, in the broader sense of the word, and that's where you get into discussions on what's in and what's out kind of thing. But think of it from prevention to menstrual cycle recording and fertility type management, all the way through to managing breast cancer. So that's sort of as broad as possible. Anything that affects women's health, or FemTech is the other label given to that particular area. So that's received a lot of attention. We have seen a substantial growth in a number of ventures being founded and focusing on this space. It is a space that has really distinguished itself in terms of its clinical evidence. Where we've got a challenge, and there I'm talking globally, but it's not too different at a Europe level, where we're seeing a challenge in women's health is it's kind of that Series A glut, as I like to call it, which is a lot of ventures are doing well at attracting funding in their early stages. I mean, there are quite a few government bodies that help along the way. But then they get to that Series A level where they need to start switching increasingly to a more private funding environment. And that's where we have, in Europe, generally speaking, a challenge. And women's health is no exception. So that's the more therapeutic area side. Let me just, you're going to ask a question before I talk about.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about just briefly, the private funding. Why is that more challenging?
It's when compared to the US, private funding in Europe is subscale. But when compared to the US, right. Why is that? There's a variety of reasons for that. I think, you have less depth in terms of investors. Those investors that do exist tend to be a little more risk averse than they are in the US. They tend to favor, for example, more sort of intellectual property driven type funding if they are healthcare investors versus, say, the pure technology ones. And of course, a lot of investors are still looking at the European digital landscape going, okay, so where's the success story here? Where's the big bang outcome that says, I can really place a bet here and demonstrate a 10x exit? Of course, that situation is compounded a little bit over the last couple of years for the reasons that we described a bit earlier on in our conversation. We are seeing an IPO window that's not closed, but it's not happening. SPACs are out of fashion a bit because they kind of left everyone with a bit of a bitter taste. Babylon comes to mind.
Yes.
And so if you're an investor, you're kind of looking at where's my exit? And therefore, if you're dedicated and specialized in healthcare, you're going to diversify. I was talking to an investor only about 2-3 weeks ago that had a fairly strong digital health mandate 2 or 3 years ago. They've clearly been directed by their investment committee to be more biased towards biotech than towards digital health, for example. So, it's a bit of a shift in thinking there. But there's no exact answer to your question, but there's certainly some telltale signs that gives you an idea why.
Just on that thing, the poster child of the rallying flag for VCs and others. Recently we've had Hinge Health IPOing in the US, and we've had some other companies there that look like they might move now on the back of that in a similar direction. UK and Europe, are there any? Um, has there been any recent great success highlights of companies that have done that in the UK or Europe?
In terms of going public,
Yes, or some other big, you know, event that is proving, I guess, the long term value and ROI and payback for investors.
so it, it's a difficult, it's a challenging question to ask at this stage, largely because of the market conditions I described to you. But
Mm,
generally speaking, Europe is a little bit further behind the US in terms
mm,
of speed of advance and that move towards sort of public listing, etc. But in the public market, or publicly listing at the moment, it's not an easy place to be. So everyone was looking at the Hinge IPO very closely. There was a hunch they were going to list, but way back in January when the JP Morgan Healthcare conference takes place every year in San Francisco in the early weeks of January, and so
mm,
there was already speculation about who would start filing the S1 as it's called in order to announce the fact that they were going to list. And of course, Hinge announced, and then shortly after, Omada Health is the other one that announced. So Hinge is an interesting company. It's certainly one that has demonstrated very strong traction. It's a company focused on musculoskeletal. And so we have been tracking it for some time, and we were intrigued to see what the S1 would say and what data points, traction data points, they were able to demonstrate, and of course how that would be received by the market. To all sense and purposes, it was very well received by the market, but I think the market has been looking for good news, and so let's see what happens to IPOs down the road. In Europe, to answer your question more directly, we haven't seen that yet. Unfortunately, invariably, a lot of ventures that need scale in Europe tend to then step into the US in order to get that scale. Thinking of, for example, Ada Health in Germany, for example, Care Syntax in Germany. Large companies that have built profile because invariably they've taken that step of moving into the US and growing their US market share. More closer to home, there's endless speculation around, for example, Dr. Lib, a very large French, appointment booking, telehealth type company that has built scale, has built partnerships, has acquired, ventures in Europe, and therefore has that gravitas and that scale that says, hey, maybe that's where they should be going next. But question is, if you're going to list, where are you going to list? And at the moment, of course, the environment's a bit difficult.
yeah.
We don't really know the US market, if that's where you're going to go, because it's more likely to IPO there because of the general market appetite. But the US dollars, dropped 10% in value in the past month and a half, 2 months, let's say. So, you've got dynamics that you need to take into account that will affect your investment thesis in relation to do you go public or not.
Yeah. Okay. Let's just go back to sort of European funding, and we talked about the therapeutic area. What about stages? Early stage versus late stage. What are you seeing there? Is there any particular stage where we were seeing more funding, or what does that look like?
No, it's definitely worth looking at that profile. But let me just touch very quickly on one of the questions you asked I didn't answer, and that is, if you look, we looked at therapeutic area, we didn't look at the sort of the more categories of technology. So very quickly to give you a flavor, what we're seeing, where we see the dollars go are health management solutions. Those are the sort of solutions that health systems use in order to be much more productive and efficient. So we're seeing a lot of focus there. Not only from health systems looking to build the partnerships and bringing in technology, ambient listening, those type of technologies, for example, but also from investors who know that that's going to be a growth area, and of course are seeing some real light bulb moments as we start looking at Gen AI being pulled into those type of challenges and helping health systems be more efficient. And, you live in the UK, and never really a week goes by without some headline around the UK, a wait list, or the UK's got this issue, etc. We can talk about the NHS too at some stage. But anyway, so that's one. Definitely a focus. The other relates back to something I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, which is this shift in focus from pharmacos towards the R&D side, what's affectionately known now as tech bio, the opposite of biotech, tech bio. And that is, of course, investment in solutions that are very much focused around upticking really the productivity of the research and the clinical development of drugs in pharmacos. So big investments there from investors. So certainly if you're in those two areas and you're doing something really exciting, you will get the attention of investors without doubt. And then in Europe, you've got this kind of, I'm talking about the top three, but in Europe, you've got kind of equal general patient solutions, rehab, digital therapeutics, that kind of stuff. And then, of course, medical diagnostics. And that's starting to edge forward a little bit. Slight contrast, the US is definitely medical diagnostics as the third. As you see health systems trying to pull those things in, for example. In the UK, Europe, we kind of get that equal third between patient solutions and medical diagnostics. So we'll see what Q2 reveals. To your question. So a lot of the data points out there that people can read in the public domain tend to be limited to Q1, which is a positive story. Of course, we know what happened on the 2nd of April, the inverted commas Liberation Day. And so, of course, since then, we've seen nothing but, tariffs on, tariffs off, tariffs on, tariffs off, some various other things, and an increasing loss of confidence in the US market. So it's created an awful lot of uncertainty in the system. And so what does that mean for Q2? We come back to some numbers, but, Q1 total funding at a global level is about 8.5 billion. Mm-hmm. But if I switch to looking at let me just clarify. Coming back to what you were saying before, the funding in Q1 in the globe as a whole was, I think, let me just double check my numbers so I don't say anything silly. Mm-hmm. Q1 2025 total funding was 2.1 billion, which is a strong quarter. And I think if you look at that, and I'm talking about Europe, if you look at that versus where Q2 is, Q2, which is obviously not finished, we still have a whole month to go, is looking on track to be, I'll be positive here, let's say match Q1. Okay. Despite the volatility, which is not bad. And I'm caveating that hugely in terms of I'm being positive, and two, the quarter's not out. So we could end up with a really strong June, or it could just fizzle because people are even more concerned with what's going on because we're about a month away from the so-called pausing of the tariffs. So do we see the can kick down the road some more, or do we see doubling down? Who knows? So it's we're in a positive world. So if we do end up with a Q2 as strong as a Q1, then we're technically on track, all being well. And again, I'm being as positive as I possibly can here. We're technically on track with 25 closing ahead of 2024, which would be good news. Okay, because it would really show that bottom corner them going up. And I think in normal circumstances that would be the case. But I'm, I don't sound like a scratch record, but I am caveating these heavily because we are in a new normal. Yeah. And so in terms of stages, in 25, and at this stage, we're looking year to date May. Early stage is about, at the moment, 580 or so million US dollars invested early stage ventures in Europe. Contrast that with growth stage, about 1.1 billion. Okay. And then late stage, 1.3 billion. Now, what's that telling us? What you're seeing is two things. One, the phenomenon I described a bit earlier on, this sort of Series A glut. So you get a nice input of funding, both private and public, in the early stage. stages, sorry, and then we get stuck. But we're also seeing that uncertainty driving investors towards the more later stage ventures because there is greater proof, there is technically less risk, etc. So all those things are kind of driving more towards late stages. There's an anomaly to that, of course, as well. No one in Europe probably missed the investment declared in February, I think, for a Swedish company called Neco Health, which raised a $260 million US Series B. That's an unheard of number, unheard of at that size of Series B. Now, you could put your finger on many reasons why that happened, but one of the primary reasons we believe it happened is because one of the founders is the Spotify founder.
Right.
So, a founder with a significant track record of making things happen and therefore inspires confidence with the investor community.
Yeah. If you were a investor, or on the other side, if you're HealthTech looking for an investor, what are some of the key things now that perhaps investors are looking for? Perhaps that perhaps they weren't in the heady days, immediately post-COVID. I assume it's things, clear evidence or path to profit or patent or some, valuable, proven proposition or IP, or what are some of the things that are key to investment decisions right now?
No, you're right. Things seem to have shifted, definitely. Building on the conversation we had, we talked about what therapeutic areas are hot and what sort of technology areas were hot. That still becomes, I guess, a foundation stone as to what investors are looking at, etc.
Yeah.
But what fundamentals have shifted since 2021? 21, you could rock up with a good pitch deck, tell a good story, look credible, and you pick up some money because there's a lot of money swashbuckling around and it was looking for a home. Those things have changed. Definitely changed. And what's changed? I think you hit a couple of ones on the head. One is clearly path to profit, demonstrating that you are heading towards profit. So growth at any cost is gone. It's really around demonstrating the fact that you can show unit economics and you can show that at some stage you are going to go beyond the break even into profit. So that's the first one, definitely. And that's hard. If you're an early stage venture in healthcare, that is mega hard. So you've got to be able to demonstrate that.
Yeah.
The second one, and we can dive into those depending on your questions, but the second one is clearly proof points. So profitability is one proof point. Clinical evidence is definitely another proof point. Not always relevant to every venture, by the way. If you're wellness doing yoga, I'm not trying to be derogatory here. I'm just saying there are some digital health ventures for whom clinical evidence is less required versus, I guess, number of users and number of, the ARR or even the MRR of those particular ventures. But if you are clearly in that medical diagnosis space or you're looking at something that's much more clinical, then you need to demonstrate in a true bona fide way that what you're saying on the tin is what you're able to do. And so you're looking for that. So certainly proof points are massively important. And so you're having to travel longer to be able to demonstrate those points in order to go and get the funding.
Yeah.
Couple of things I would say about that, which are not always common with European digital health ventures, and that is you can't just rock up in front of an investor's front door and say, hey, I'm ready for investment. You need to invest a fair amount of time in building that relationship so that when it is time, there's no opening the Pandora's box and go, hey, I'm here. But I digress slightly. So coming back to your point, I think the third element that certainly renders that attraction is inevitable AI. You have to demonstrate how you're leveraging, let's say, Gen AI, to be more specific, in what you're bringing to market. Largely because if you're not, somebody else will be. And so there's an expectation that you have that. There's an accusation as well that investors are discriminating towards that versus looking at the broader needs in healthcare. But you certainly need to be able to demonstrate how you're harnessing the power of Gen AI within what you're building.
Yeah. Just I'm curious on the relationships piece. Clearly, I guess, do you mean keeping, those relationships warm in terms of like the initial, whoever the initial investors were? But do you mean beyond that and thinking about how do you engage with a broader set of potential investors?
Yes, no, I mean basically
Yeah,
building a relationship. So,
yeah,
starting from scratch. I mean, that's why we come into play with our, the startups that use our platform.
yeah,
Identifying who's investing at your stage where you are now, but also the next stage, and therefore making use of the platform and a bit of LinkedIn, but there's other things, conferences, the usual story, as you know, the usual diet, and starting to engage with those players and those investors that at some stage you can call upon to make a decision, and therefore you want to get them comfortable with what you're doing. You'll probably get some very valuable advice anyway through those particular conversations, but start looking at getting into a pattern where you're on their radar, albeit not as an investee, but on their
yeah,
radar, but
yeah,
also you're starting to feed them on a periodic basis updates on how you're doing.
yeah,
And you'll find, a lot of VCs are not, are venture builders. They're not financial engineers. They're actually interested in how do you build that particular venture, and will provide you with, no doubt, some interesting tidbits on
yeah,
what they've seen elsewhere, and therefore you might want to bring, particularly if they like you and they like what you're doing, kind of thing.
yeah, yeah,
But I would advise to achieve that. Look at not necessarily an advisory board. It sounds pretty established, but think about the two or three people who have those connections, that that Rolodex, to use a really old term here, but and then will help you bridge those relationships
yeah,
and establish the relationships, because invariably when you want the funding, and that journey, as you probably know yourself, that journey can be quite long, and it is at the
yes,
moment even longer.
yes.
You don't want to be starting to build a relationship on top of that, essentially sales cycle of trying to get funding on board.
Yeah, yeah, good advice. Uh, very. Let's keep this one reasonably brief if we can. But of
Yeah.
course, you can't really talk about the UK without talking about the NHS in the context of health. Have you seen any? And clear, I think everybody knows some of the challenges of working with the NHS and how
Yes.
cumbersome that can be, and all these different engagement points and decision makers and the trusts all slightly different in the way they operate. But have you seen anybody that you think has cracked the code on this? Has been
Yes, it
successful?
depends on what we mean by
Yeah.
cracking the code. The NHS is, someone described to me a few years ago in a very apt way, which is, it's not that big whale you're trying to harpoon.
Mm.
It's this massive shoal of fish,
Yeah.
which is that success is one trust doesn't mean that suddenly you're going to go and have success with all the other trusts. And so it's a really complex animal to engage with, a complex animal to build a relationship with, and a complex animal to get into bed with, so to speak, in terms of, partnering and scaling, etc. And so, yes, there are ventures out there that have successfully built engagements with the NHS.
Mm.
And of course, the NHS is, England, Scotland, etc. So you've got that
Mm.
complexity. And of course,
Yeah.
NHS England, or more specifically, the current government announced a
Yeah.
month ago or 2 months ago that NHS
Yeah.
England was going to be essentially be replaced by something. No one really knows what, but it's going to be replaced by something. And so I think that adds a certain element of unknown uncertainty in the system. From all our conversations, and the NHS is a client of ours, for all our conversations with the NHS, the guys on the ground, the coalface, are getting on with it. They're not letting announcements like the one about NHS England get in the way. And so, because there's a need by a health system like the NHS to figure out how they deliver a standard of healthcare despite all the limitations that they're facing, not just funding, but also workforce limitations, etc. So yes, I think the general advice from what I hear in relation to the NHS is, you've got to understand you're picking pieces of the NHS one at a time to be able to get traction. If you look at, conferences out there, particularly in Europe, and the
Mm.
ones that the NHS attends, invariably you've got all sorts of senior stakeholders from the various trusts turning up.
Yeah.
And obviously going to be very committed to what their trust is doing. And so you got to recognize that, your conversation will just be with that piece of the NHS, not with the broader NHS. And the fact that they have that specific need doesn't necessarily mean that that other trust is going to be focused on the same need.
Yeah. Yes, complex beast. Let's move to wrapping up.
Yeah.
I love these conversations. We could talk for an hour on all of these topics that we've covered,
Yeah.
and maybe we'll do a follow up at some point. But let's just move to a wrap up. Just tell me about Galen Growth, Julian, and HealthTech Alpha. What's next for you? What's your ambition in the next couple of years for your company?
So, question that I ask myself pretty much every morning I get up. Where's next? Where's the next opportunity? But keeping it at a more sort of high level, more fundamental, more strategic level, I do try to respect what I say. And what I mean by that is a lot of the advice that I was sharing on this call, I try to obviously make real as far as we are concerned and my team. So what are we doing? Listen, we originated in Singapore, almost specifically in Asia Pacific. We then established a a company in Europe to really try and help our clients based in Europe and have presence in Europe. And then we eventually did the same in the US and established an office in Chicago. And so we're very new to the US market. If you look at our life cycle, which is unusual. Normally people start that way and go east. So we are looking at the US market very closely in terms of, an area of growth of the business. But if I were keeping it at those big buckets to answer your questions in terms of what's next, we are looking at our business model as a whole and rethinking how we do that differently, largely because technology, client needs, all those things are continuously evolving. And therefore, we need to recognize that. So we're looking at that as boldly as we can and seeing how we can take what we're good at to market, but allow consumers to buy it differently. We're definitely moving into what I call deeper insights. Data is all very good. But it's how do you help your clients make sense of that data, get better insights from it, actionable insights, things they can do stuff with rather than this is clever, but I don't know what to do with it. And therefore, how do you help them in ways that are directly relevant to them? And so, some of the signals, the indicators I was talking about at the beginning of our conversation, how do we help them get more value out of those things, and how do we evolve those things to really align with what they're doing? And then, of course, the inevitable for us, which is how do we continue to harness the power of technology in bringing even better, stronger value proposition to our clients? As you can imagine, Gen AI is something that is a journey we started on a long time ago. And then, of course, as that speeds up, and it is speeding up an incredible, velocity, how do we continue making sure that is a part of what we do? And that's at two levels. It's also, it's at what clients are seeing and how they're benefiting. And of course, there you can imagine most of our clients' expectations are being set by what they're seeing elsewhere. So we need to we're driven by that. But also, how do we use it on the bit they don't see? The iceberg thing almost. Most of Galen Growth's activity, resources, and focus is really what clients only see the output of. But we are looking at all the ways in which the technology helps us do that better, and really to the advantage of our clients.
Awesome. Well, we wish you luck with that.
Thank you.
Let me finish with the last question, which is a question everybody receives, which is tell us about a leader, a mentor, maybe another entrepreneur perhaps that you've really admired or spent time with, but somebody who's had a great influence on your professional career or your entrepreneurial journey. And just to give you a flavour, because just in case you need a bit more thinking time, I've had all sorts of answers on this.
Yeah, sure.
Quite often, for a lot of people, it's an early figure, quite early on in their careers. That comes up quite a lot. But we've had, sometimes it's been clients. Very rarely is it somebody famous, but there's a few that have cropped up. But who's it been for you?
Yeah,
and it may not just be one person, by the way. It might be several.
Well, no, I was going to say that it depends on what you mean by early in your career. It's a fascinating question, but I guess what I'd say is that I don't think I've had a mentor or somebody that you use as a reference point for throughout my entire career. And I've had obviously a career with various chapters to it, the armed forces, and then big corporate, and then now more, building a company. But to try and answer your question in a way that's helpful, if I look at my period of the last 10 years as the entrepreneur as being one particular chapter, I would say that there is one person that I have regularly. I mean, I have a board of directors, of course, so park that for a minute. There is one who acts as a sounding board for the company, without doubt. But more specifically, somebody who I find incredibly helpful, particularly as I'm trying to solve things or trying to overcome issues. And as somebody that appeared in my journey at Galen Growth right from the beginning. And it's Nawal Roy, who is the CEO and the founder of Holmusk, which is a well-established, very successful digital health company focused on mental health. And that relationship came about before he'd even founded Holmusk. When he was doing his groundwork, he was reaching out in Singapore. He was reaching out to various people in the Singapore ecosystem who had healthcare background experience and had set off on an entrepreneur type journey in order to understand the system better and how to solve it, etc. And that was a fascinating character. He has absolutely no healthcare experience before he stepped into Holmusk. But anyway, he and I have traveled this journey for the last 10 years, roughly. He on Holmusk, me with Galen Growth. And we often touch base, but usually it's me more so than him, because largely because I think in his speed of advance with Holmusk, he has grown much faster than I have, or than we have at Galen Growth. And therefore, I think he encountered some of the challenges and questions that I encounter now that he probably encountered a few years ago. And therefore, an immense valuable depth of experience in terms of structuring deals or, overcoming certain operational issues, etc. Sorry, I'm losing my voice again. But if you look at that 10-year journey, that's probably one person that I have more frequently happily reached out to, saying, hey, listen, this is the question I'm trying to solve. This is how I think I should solve it. What's your thoughts?
Just say the name again. I didn't quite get the...
Nawal Roy.
Nawal, that's right.
Nawal, Roy, R-O-Y, sorry. He's the CEO of Holmusk, H-O-L-M-U-S-K.
That's right.
Mental health, real world evidence, real world data type specialist.
Great. Good example there. Julien, thanks. That was a great session. Covered a lot there. Thank you. Thank you so much.
That's it. As you said, we could have covered a lot more. I totally agree with you. But listen, fascinating to be able to answer your questions and hopefully add a bit more color to what we do and to digital health and the phenomenon that is in itself. But we welcome anyone who's got any questions to reach out directly to myself, and we'll do our best to answer them.
Super, and we'll put some links, of course, to you and the website when we post this, which will be very soon. Super, Julien, I'll let you go. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for yours.
Take care.